All right, today we are taking a look at a system called market DNA. What you're about to see is purely a visual documentation. Everything is based entirely on the source material we were provided. Our goal here is just to walk through it, step by step. So what we're looking at is a proprietary geometric system designed for markets. And it's really important to stress that our role here is simply to document. We're going to follow the process exactly as it's been laid out. We're not analyzing, we're not interpreting, we're just observing. So yeah, you can think of this whole thing as an observational walkthrough. We're just following a very specific set of visuals and data points to see how this method works. So with that said, let's get into it. Okay, let's start digging into the specifics. The documentation uses a case study to show us how the system operates. And our focus is going to be on the US100 index, which, as you know, tracks the NASDAQ 100. Here are the specific identifiers for the case study we're following. The asset is, of course, the US100. And the particular cycle we are documenting has an ID of US100_3_1. These labels are going to be pretty important for keeping track of the whole process. Now, this is where the documentation really makes a point to set this system apart. It tells us exactly what it doesn't use. So there's no technical analysis. There's no fundamental analysis. And, get this, there are no quantitative indicators. This makes it a purely geometric approach, which is pretty unique. So that brings us right to the first phase of the documentation, which is called entry and risk. This is all about the initial setup for a brand new cycle. It's where all the key parameters get defined right from the very beginning. And here's the chart that's provided for phase 1. The main thing to notice here is that the price has reached the level labeled M. That M is defined as the primary entry level for this whole cycle. Okay, let's break down the key parameters for this phase. First, we have the primary entry, M, at 25,316.4. Then there's also a secondary entry, PC, at a slightly lower price. The documentation also points out a trapezoid time duration of 19 days and a risk coefficient of 3. All of these are the crucial inputs for what comes next. All right, next up, the documentation shows us a risk preview. Now, it is really important to remember that this is all based on a set of hypothetical inputs. Think of it as a theoretical calculation, not an actual live trade. The first hypothetical number is the starting capital. For this particular example, it's set at an even $100,000. And the second one is the maximum allowed drawdown. This is basically the most an investor would hypothetically be okay with losing, and in this case, that's set at 5%. So using those inputs, the system calculates a trade size. The result for each of the two potential entries comes out to 0.08. And I know you're probably asking, okay, but how did it come up with that number? Well, the documentation actually gives us the exact formula, and I'm going to read this to you word for word because it's a mandatory part of documenting this process. Here it is. Both trade sizes are calculated using the hypothetical capital, the investor's maximum allowed drawdown, the third triangle domain percentage, the risk coefficient, and the contract size. Okay, so we've got the entry and risk parameters all laid out. Now let's flip over to the other side of the coin, the targets. This next part of the documentation is all about projecting the potential outcomes. The documentation clearly outlines 3 different price targets. Target 1, or T1, is that first level we see there. Target 2, T2, is located at a point called Apex N. And the final target, T3, is way up at the top of that trapezoid shape we saw earlier. Each of these represents a different possible exit point. So based on those entry points we talked about and these potential targets, the documentation then lays out 2 completely different profit scenarios. Let's take a look at how they compare. And here they are, side by side. In scenario 1, only that first entry gets triggered, and the trade is exited at target 3. The calculated profit in that case is $740. But in scenario 2, both entry points get hit, and with exits at 2 different targets, the calculated profit is a lot higher, at $1,395. The documentation even projects the potential annual returns for each of those scenarios. Okay, to wrap this up, let's see what the documentation says about the path forward after phase 1. And, just as important, we're going to cover the required disclaimers. According to the documentation, there are 2 possible sequences of phases that can happen after phase 1. There's the normal path, which just follows the phases in numerical order, 1, 2, 3, 4, but there's also an alternative path, where phase 3 could actually happen before phase 2.
And we'll end on some very important disclaimers that come directly from the source material. First, this is not financial advice. Second, the system prohibits using leverage above 10. It also advises you not to invest essential personal funds. And finally, remember this entire explainer is being presented strictly as part of public model documentation. So the real question is, what will the progression of this cycle ultimately show us about the model structure? Well, that's a question that only further observation can answer.